Shaun Stimpson, welcome to Acquiring Minds.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for having me.
Shaun, you started as a mid-career searcher in your 40s, and today you're building toward a large business over the long term in industrial distribution, not a space we hear much about in our world. Let's get right into it. Some background to start us off, please. Shaun, background on you.
Sure. So I grew up in the Boston area, spent about 20 years in the wealth management space. About 8 of those years was as an individual contributor working directly with customers. And then the final 13 was in leadership, divided between 6 years at Morgan Stanley on the wealth management side, and then 7 years at Bank of America Private Bank. And so I left Bank of America in 2021, searched for 18 months, acquired the first business in December of 2022, and we're coming up on the 3-year anniversary, which is kind of crazy. It's kind of flown by.
Yeah, that was very concise. Thank you, Shaun. Some follow-ups. Being in wealth management is actually very sales centric, right? So say more about. For people who don't know, they might think that that's a finance-heavy job, but in fact, it's more of a client-centric, sales-heavy job. Correct?
I would say that. Yeah, I think when I first got in the business, I sort of imagined a firm, handing me a bunch of clients and me managing their money. It's really, in the beginning, especially, it's only like 10% of that. It's really 90%. Business development, so growing the business and building the business, and so it's a lot of going out and finding clients, and then obviously bringing them into the organization. And I would say it's definitely much more sales, business development heavy.
We'll get there. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but for example, cold calling was something that you had a lot of experience with.
Yeah. So when my first job out of school was at Merrill Lynch, and I would make, 200, phone calls a day, and I'd get to the office at 8:30. And, sometimes I wouldn't put the phone down until, except for going to lunch, I wouldn't put the phone down until, 7, 8 o'clock at night. And so, as a searcher, that was, that was something that I was very comfortable with. And I joke, when I was searching, I made about 1,100 calls. I would do that in a week, at Merrill Lynch. And so, my expectation was to call a much bigger number of owners during the search phase. But I was lucky, found some opportunities, and early on especially, and ended up, closing one of those.
And you, after having only called 11 or 1,200, which is 11 or 1,200 more than most searchers call. So we'll get there. Just so the audience understands who they're hearing from, and kind of your orientation. You're a sales-oriented person?
Yeah, I would say I'm a sales professional that spent the last 13 years of their career in a sales leadership role, really driving business development within the 2 organizations that I was a part of.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay. So you're in wealth management for almost did you say 2 decades?
20 years. Yeah.
20 years. Why then the pivot? How did search enter your story?
Sure. So I did my MBA at Babson College. I was working in Wellesley at the time, Wellesley, Mass, which is where Babson is, and did their part-time program over 2 years. And for anyone that knows Babson, it's all about entrepreneurship. And so, during my time there, I just met a lot of people that had alums that had gone there and, made, career moves into, buying a business. And, so sort of the idea popped into my head that, maybe at some point, I would leave wealth management and go buy a company. But I never really put a tremendous amount of thought into what type of company, how would I go about doing it, et cetera. And so, but it was always something that was in the back of my head. And I remember sitting, going to a Babson alumni event and sitting next to a guy that joked, he was in the corporate world like I was for 20 plus years, and eventually got sick of it and left and bought a painting business. And, I imagined him, up on a step ladder painting houses, and, after some diligence, figured out that he owned a fairly large, commercial painting business in the Boston area. So I always, thought if I ever got fired or, I ever got, downsized, instead of, trying to go and find, another place, that I would, make the leap and buy a company. But, I imagine it happening, in my 50s and, much later career.
And so why then did it happen? Did you get fired?
No, actually, I left on a pretty good note, and I started exploring search after a meeting that really kind of changed my life. I was having lunch with one of the advisors that I worked with at Bank of America Private Bank. And the gentleman we were having lunch with was one of his clients, and a gentleman that had made his wealth in the private equity space. And I asked him, I said, Bill, how'd you make your money? And he explained to me his story. It's the first company he bought. They bought it for $4 million, and they put $900 in equity into the deal. This is back in the early 80s, and borrowed the rest. And he sold it 5 years later for a multiple of what he purchased it for. And he did that 50 more times. And, that's how he accumulated his wealth. And, the first thing I thought walking out of that meeting was, man, you took the wrong classes in business school. At Babson, I didn't take any type of corporate finance, deal structure, financial modeling type classes. And so the second thought in my head was, maybe I should do a little bit more digging and, figure out how this guy, did this. And that's kind of when my journey started. And so I actually went back to Babson at that point, and took a couple of classes via a certificate program that they offered. In the second class that I took, which was entitled, I think, M&A for Entrepreneurs, they introduced the concept of search. And so that began what eventually was a 5-year kind of knowledge grab for me, because I was older at that point, and I started that was 2016. So I was 39 at that point. And I spent 5 years, studying search, talking to a lot of searchers, people that had failed, people that had bought companies, people like me that were thinking about search. And I talked to probably about 100 people over that 5-year window that somehow were related to the search field. And then eventually, made the leap and launched my search in June of 2021. And yeah, it took me 18 months, but I finally did it.
Shaun, this client of your managers, this guy at lunch who you hear his story, you ask him how he made his money. I assume, being in the wealth management world, you were constantly, for 20 years, in fact, interacting with wealthy people. And that probably wasn't the first time that you had asked one of them, so how'd you make your money? Maybe that was a question you asked everybody. Why did his method of making money strike you so? Why did it resonate with you so much?
That's a great question. I think that typically a lot of the people that I would meet, they had founded a company and built a business, or in the private banking worlds, we were dealing with extremely wealthy people, and so a lot of their stories were very public. This guy, his story wasn't as public, and so I didn't really know it as well as some of the other folks that I had met. And it's interesting, kind of as a side topic, as I was trying to sort of develop my investment thesis on, what type of company I would buy if I did leave and do a search, or earlier in the phase before I knew about search, what type of company I'd go out and buy. A lot of the CEOs that I would meet, I could think of this one guy that owned a chemical business, and asking him, how much do you actually know about, the chemicals that you're making? And he said, well, I couldn't go into a lab and mix things up, but at a high level, I understand what we do. And, my role is more from a strategy and from a leadership perspective. And so, a lot of those conversations were encouraging to me, that I didn't have to go and try to acquire a wealth management business, that, my skills in leadership were transferable to other industries. Hence, how I ended up in the industrial distribution world.
Mm-hmm. Great. And we are definitely going to want to hear how you developed that thesis. As
Sure.
I said, not a typical place searchers look. These finance classes that you went back and took because you said to yourself, boy, I did not take the right classes when I was in business school the first time. A lot of people may not even have an MBA. And the finance piece or the modeling piece is the key hard skill that they lack in buying a business. And it's very intimidating, off-putting to a lot of people. Tell us about your journey from knowing less to more about finance. How important do you feel like those two later classes you took are? Do you recommend other people do something similar? Expand on that little piece for us.
I would highly recommend it. That gentleman that I had lunch with, I'll never forget, he said to me, he goes, Shaun, private equity is nothing more than a complex math problem. And so the modeling and deal structure and, understanding the key variables, I think, my personal opinion, I think that's an imperative part of the diligence process. And so being able to solicit financial statements from the owners that I was talking to, the sellers that I was talking to, and then to, build a model, create a deal structure, and forecast out, what I thought the business was going to do over time. I don't know what I would have done if I didn't have that experience. And I think having that ability really kind of lessened the burden for me of relying on outside advisors. And I'm assuming you could probably pay a CPA firm, an outside provider to build those models and to, diligence, the financials. Obviously, when you're making an acquisition, doing a quality of earnings is imperative. But leading up to that, a lot of that diligence that I did, I felt I saved quite a bit of money in the search phase. And it also allowed me to get to know the companies a lot better, I think, than most, as you're going through that process and, inputting all the different variables into that model.
And even the value of doing it that you just described outweighs the fact that you're probably not going to do it as well as a third-party service provider. If some searchers listening, they may do a few models. It may be their first models because they don't come from finance land, whereas they could have their diligence provider do that, and the diligence provider does it all day long. And so it's kind of like, learning a skill not very well. Why not just outsource the whole thing and just invest your time in finding a good service provider to do that, rather than kind of trying to figure out how to do it yourself?
So I'm someone that doesn't come from a field, where I'm, building models all day, like investment banking or consulting. And so, I think over time, especially during the search phase, I got better at it, and it made me personally made me, I feel, a better negotiator, better at diligence, better at digging in, with the seller. And so, it may stop once you buy a company. And, I don't know how many people like me are aspiring to go out and continue to acquire. But it's, at least for what I'm doing, where we're not stopping and haven't stopped with one acquisition, it's something that I've continued. And again, I think it saves you some money on the diligence, while you're searching and in post search. But the more important piece of it is it allows you to, really get into the weeds on the numbers, and really understand the business at a different level. Whereas if I didn't have that experience, and I was relying on someone else, I'm not sure how well I would truly understand the numbers and the story behind them.
Yeah. That's well put, Shaun. Okay, great. And so these finance classes that you took, that you went back to Babson to take, what did you take, and lay it out for people who might say to themselves, "Boy, I could do that. I should do that."
Yeah, this was a certificate program. I started out just calling up the school and saying, "Hey, is there a platform that would allow someone that already graduated with an MBA to go back and take a couple of classes?" And they recommended it was a 9-credit certificate program that had an application process, required the GMAT, but was fairly simple. They already had all my records and everything, so it was a pretty easy process to tackle.
But it did require the GMAT.
I think it did. I'm pretty sure that it did. I'm pretty confident that it required
that's a
the
hurdle.
GMAT. Yeah.
But go ahead.
So I, went back and took 2 classes over 2 different semesters. And the first one was, I think, entitled Entrepreneurial Finance. It was a case-based class where you would look at different acquisitions in each case, build out models, and then make the case for the structure that you selected to do the acquisition or buy the business. And it was 15 weeks of doing that over and over and over again. And then the second class was also case-based. It was, as I mentioned, M&A for entrepreneurs, case-based, but also introduced other topics that like search, and dove in deeper into different types of financing structures. And the professor brought in people that had bought companies, whether it was through a search or some other avenue. And really it was kind of like the second iteration of the first class that I took. So it was a good progression of coursework.
And these were remote.
Well, actually, so the first one was not. The second one was remote. At the time, Babson had a program that allowed part-time MBAs that were coming from other geographies, where they would do an online. It was kind of a hybrid program where they would do the majority of the coursework remote, virtually, combined with a couple of full-day in-person sessions. And the students that were in that curriculum, the full-day classes would be, all day Friday, all day Saturday, so they could make the trip up from Miami to do that program, and not have to make multiple trips, throughout the course of the semester. So it was coordinated. And so for me at the time, I was, traveling quite a bit. And so it was perfect for me because I could, remote in every Wednesday, and then I was, just took a day off from work to participate in the full day sessions on the 2 Fridays.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it sounds really valuable. It's taking the GMAT to access something like this, and then the time commitment itself is obviously, a year plus commitment in and of itself. But it sure seemed like it set you up nicely and filled a gap in your knowledge that a lot of people listening will similarly have. So I thank you for sharing how you did that.
Sure.
Very valuable.
And for me, the other piece to it was, these professors, were invaluable advisors to me through the search process. And so the gentleman that taught the second class that I took, I should probably write him a check for $50,000 or $100,000 for all the sort of consulting work that he did or advisory work that he did for me, through the search. And so the network that I was able to build, through that program, was invaluable. And it was, started with those two professors, and, there were a couple other professors that they had introduced me to that I really leaned on. And, I don't think I would have been successful had it not been, for the guidance and the advisory relationship that they have. So that was kind of a, unplanned, call it, benefit of going through that program.
Yeah, absolutely. Great, Shaun. Well, let's turn our attention now to what I keep teasing, the industrial distribution thesis. Why did you choose that industry?
So I had, back to my days as an advisor where I worked directly with clients, I had a client that owns an industrial distribution business. And so he turned me on to that space. And so when I started to get a little bit more specific into the type of business that I wanted to buy, I really started to dive into that space and, understands, not necessarily how the business operated, but, the characteristics of that business. So, a lot outside of a few states that are in the South, most of these companies, aren't concentrated in one particular industry. Some, not a lot, have customer concentrations, but most don't. The companies that we've bought don't have a significant customer concentration. The technical knowledge of that exists within these businesses at a larger size doesn't only rest with the owner themselves. But I also found that, at least in New England, the sampling that I did, there were a lot of owners in their 60s and 70s that didn't have a succession plan. And I used LinkedIn to try to scout out to see if a child or a sibling, worked within the business. And, at face value, I didn't see a lot of companies in this space that had a succession plan. And again, most of the owners were in their 60s and 70s. So I thought, there was not a succession problem, but certainly an opportunity for me to focus on an industry that had a lot of owners that might be open to selling to someone like me.
Yeah. Well, on the other hand, a lot of the industries that searchers look at have that same dynamic. And in fact, when we're sold on ETA broadly, that's something that is a kind of a sweeping generalization about so many small businesses in America, that there aren't succession plans in place. Give us an example of a SKU of a SKU that you would distribute. So just
Sure.
to have a better picture, because it still feels kind of abstract when I think industrial distribution.
Sure. So 50%, if you combine the three companies that we own, 50% of our sales are fluid connectors.
Fluid connectors.
Fluid connectors. So fluid connectors is a fancy term for rubber hoses or hydraulic hoses.
Okay.
And so if you think of like a John Deere tractor, there's a lot of rubber hoses on that John Deere tractor. And so in the retail component that we operate, we'll get a lot of farmers walking through our door with a busted hose. And so our job is to, get them up and running as fast as possible. And so we'll find the right hose. We'll find the fittings that go on either side of the hose. We'll fabricate those onto the hose and then get them on their way. And so again, 50% of the business is are those rubber hoses, which, you'd be surprised at how many things out there have rubber hoses on them.
Yeah,
but
I would.
In the type of businesses that we're touching each and every day.
But Shaun, I heard you say that they're outside of the South, most of these industrial distributors don't play in a single industry, that they span industries. But I would imagine that the way you'd add value as an industrial distributor is you'd be deeply concentrated in a single industry, and you'd be the one-stop solution, anything you need for that industry, and you just go deep on an industry. I'm speaking out of turn here or beyond my pay grade, but I think of aren't in the kind of hospital medical space, isn't there aren't there a few big names where it's they just provide all of the medical supplies to all the hospitals, and it's a totally consolidated, and there's just two or three big one sort of dynamic?
I would say at the manufacturing level, there are certainly a couple of dominant players, and we represent one of the most dominant, at least what we feel is the number one manufacturer in the rubber hose space and the number one manufacturer in the hydraulic space. We represent Parker Hannifin, who is one of the 800-pound gorillas. But, from a distribution perspective, it pays, at least in my eyes, to be diversified. We're, I would say, product experts when it comes to the products that we're selling and the applications that they're being used for. But those applications can span a lot of different industries. And so, you look at the bigger industries that our company focuses on. You have power generation, you have rail, defense, aerospace, and so, we as a manufacturer are broadly diversified, but the products and the knowledge that it takes to apply those products is pretty consistent across, all those different industries.
Okay, great. And then one other good feature of distribution, I assume, is that there's a recurring or highly reoccurring nature to it, that you're connecting manufacturer or supplier with end customer on a regular basis.
Yeah. So I'll throw a stat out to you. When the third letter of intent that we signed, we were the folks that lent us the mezzanine debt to buy the company also are an equity investor. And so one of the things that they look at is they look at the last 5 years of sales and what percentage of sales come from customers that buy in all 5 years. And so I remember the third company that we went through the diligence process with, their number was 65%, which they were blown away by, because in a PO type business, a non-contractual type customer relationship, in their eyes, north of 40% was a good number. So for this company to be at 65% was amazing. And so Mitten, we walked away from that third business that we had under LOI, and Mitten was the fourth LOI that we signed. They did that same analysis, and the number was 81%. So wow. 81% over the last 5 years were from customers that bought from us in all 5 of those years.
Oh, great.
Then when we bought Frank Murken Products, the number was 83%. And then FLN-MAR, the number was 85%. And so the repeat relationship or nature of the customer relationship is significantly high, and it's because of the value add that we're providing. I mean, the customers come back to us because I think we're number one, we're selling a high quality product. Number two is, we're delivering it to them when they need it, whether it's at kind of point of emergency or we're delivering it on a monthly basis if it was like an OEM type type customer. But I also think it's the advisory relationship or the value add piece that our company provides, whether it's from an engineering perspective or from a customer service type perspective. But yeah, it's a pretty high repeat business, at least the companies that we've looked at.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, let's return to the search before we get more into the businesses that you bought, which we're going to do. So when you talked to other searchers, when you went to the ETA conferences and you told them you were looking at industrial distribution, I remember you talking about the funny reactions. Say more about that.
Yeah. So, when I was in that 5-year window thinking about and studying, how I'd go about this, I attended the HBS search conference, and it just seemed like everybody at that point in time was going after a SaaS business. And so when I said industrial distribution, they looked at me like I had 10 heads. But yeah, it's appears to be a boring business, and appears, I guess, less exciting than a SaaS business, or now I feel like so many searchers are focused on the healthcare space. But yeah, it was I got a lot of funny looks, and it's worked out so far.
Do you still feel like it's a good industry for searchers to look in?
I do. I think it's a phenomenal industry, and low capex, predictable cash flow. Again, lot of retiring owners, and so I do think it's an attractive business that a searcher could step into if the right employee base exists, meaning the technical expertise exists beyond the owner. And so I do think they're great acquisition targets for searchers.
And are they concentrated in a particular region? Do these cluster anywhere, these industrial distribution businesses?
No. So when I left the bank, as we alluded to earlier, my method of outreach was cold calling, and so I cold called 1,200 owners in the 18 months that I was searching. And so how I found the people to call is I bought a list of all the industrial distributors that fell under an NAICS code. I forget what the code number is. It's like 423860, I think it was. And so there were 29,000 industrial distributors in the U.S.
Wow.
Yeah. And so the list that I had, if I did it all over again, I probably would have bought a couple of SIC codes that were much more focused. But the list only cost me a couple $1,000, and I started scrubbing it and looking into businesses, and so I was calling all over the country, and they're not concentrated in one particular area. There's industrial distributors that exist in Alaska, Hawaii, everywhere. I was really focused on a particular, or I should say, I wasn't focusing my time and energy on companies that were like, I kind of look at them as like the auto dealer model. So think of like Caterpillar, Deere, Ditch Witch type dealers. I didn't want to buy a rental equipment business. So think of like cranes and, bulldozers and, there's a lot of equipment dealers that fall into that category. So I wanted pure distribution in the hydraulic, pneumatic, fluid connector, instrumentation, seal space. And so that was a subset of the 29,000.
And so actually your thesis was dialed all the way down to wanting to be selling rubber hoses.
I wouldn't say that. I would say my thesis boiled down to focusing on companies that were value add distributors. And
what does value add mean? You've said that a couple times.
Meaning, different types of light manufacturing, whether it's hose assembly or assembly of sorts. We have a systems team that designs, builds, and tests hydraulic systems for customers. And so, I would label it as somewhat light manufacturing, but it's not someone coming to us saying, I want, 6 of these, and our job 100% of the time is to deliver, X number of widgets. There was an advice component that's built into the sales process. And so there's a reason, they're coming back to us that's not solely on price. And so the advisory piece or the value add piece is what separates you a lot from a price perspective. And, our main supplier is never going to be the cheapest option because of the quality. And so, we have to compete on other levels besides price. And so the value add component is how we do that.
And that also answers a question I had meant to ask about industrial distribution. That distribution broadly has the reputation of having pretty tight margins because, I guess to your very point, it can be quite commoditized. It's just getting, widgets from point A to point B. And so how you enjoy better margins is through value add.
I would say yes, and I'd also say from a quality perspective. So the suppliers that we're representing the majority are very high quality, and so that allows us to build a little bit more margin into the pricing that we're charging.
And can you share what net margins would be in a business like yours, or what they are in your business?
Yeah. So we're right around 40% gross profit, and then EBITDA margins are between 10 and 12%.
Mm-hmm. Which is high in for distribution businesses.
I would say it's high for distribution. It's not high for value add distribution. So if there is the value add component, typically in the businesses that I looked at while I was searching, those margins were fairly normal.
Shaun, returning to this cold calling, so 1,200 companies, and it worked. Tell us about your experience of doing this cold calling.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, I'll start out by saying why I landed on calling. Is as I mentioned, I talked to 100 plus searchers, during my diligence phase, and it seemed like to me that the folks that were finding companies or finding acquisitions faster than others were the ones where they were doing some type of proprietary search. So they weren't necessarily leaning on bankers and brokers to bring them deals. They were actively out looking for deals through cold calling, emailing, letter writing. I met, some searchers that would do handwritten notes and, send small gifts. And, but it was, they were the ones that were in control of the process and their pipeline. And so, I was older. I have, 2 kids, a wife, a mortgage. And so I'm not saying I needed to be a sprint, but I needed to take the high percentage shot in my eyes. And so calling, which was something that I was comfortable doing, back when my cold calling days at Merrill Lynch. Calling was the avenue for me. And so, so I would call the owner. Generally 9 times out of 10, you're not getting them on the phone. And so I would ask to be put into their voicemail. And, people always ask me, how do you deal with the administrative assistants or the receptionists? And, I would just really push to be put into the owner's voicemail. And so I'd leave a voicemail. Hi, my name's Shaun Stimpson. I'm a well-capitalized buyer looking to buy a business in the industry that you operate in, and wanted to see if you'd be open to having a conversation with me about your business and see if selling is something that's in the not so distant future for you.
Wow.
And
very direct.
Very direct. After I left that voicemail, I would then send them an email following up with some marketing materials attached to it about me and my search and what I'm trying to do. And I'll come back to that in a second. And I had a pretty good success rate. I about almost 25% of the people that I reached out to would respond.
25%?
Yeah. And so now, granted, some of those were, yeah, I want to talk to you. And then most of those were, no, I don't want to talk to you. And those ranges were from, my son works in the business and I'm going to pass it on to him, to F you, don't ever call me again.
Right.
1 in 5 of the 1 in 4 were open to chatting with me and having a conversation. And so, they'd call me back or email me. And, I benefited a little bit from the pandemic in that everybody was used to connecting virtually. And so I didn't really have to spend a lot of money until I went out and saw them. And by the time I went out and saw them, in most cases, I had looked at their financials, I had built a model, I had made them an indication of interest as far as a range that I would pay for the business. And so we were on the same page, or at least I had done a significant amount of qualifying before I actually went out and visited the business in most cases. And so, so that, that virtual connect, saved me quite a bit of money.
And so the cold calling, it's fair to say that you advocate other people do it. I mean, it's only gotten more difficult. Anytime any of us get an unfamiliar call on our cell phones, we immediately, screen it, which is most calls. So, so it just seems like a really, really hard way to go. I mean, let me say, Shaun, that in general, I've had my experience with talking to so many searchers on this podcast is that proprietary is just, I've come to feel that it's not worth the time. Obviously, there are countless stories where people found a business doing a proprietary search. But I just, my sense is that if you had to generalize, that the juice isn't worth the squeeze. And that's in, email outreach, let alone cold calling. Now, maybe the point is that actually cold calling is way more effective than emailing because it's personal, because it's, more right, more kind of penetrates through. Anyway, but respond to all of that. It's very counterintuitive to me that you would have such success.
So the one downside of calling is, I would say most of the owners that I talked to weren't ready to sell. Maybe emotionally they were ready, but there is an advantage to leaning on the banker broker type network, because
right,
in many cases they're coming to the table with financials, a sim, things like that. And so, the downside of calling is you're finding owners that are emotionally ready to sell, but they haven't done the necessary steps to prepare, to build a financial package. And so there is some downside. Now, the upside is it's an easy way to separate yourself. And, my process, as I talked about, I would call, I would send them an email, they would respond, and I would set up a Zoom call, which, might last 2 or 3 hours, where I'm asking them questions and really trying to qualify them. And then at the end of that call, I would say one of two things. I would say, I appreciate all the time. It doesn't sound like you'd be a good fit for what I'm trying to do. I don't want to waste your time. So, I don't think it makes sense for us to move forward. Most cases, we get to that end of the phone call. I would say, what I'd love to do is I'd love to sign an NDA. I'd love to take a look at your financials, and I'd love to come back to you with a range of what I would pay for your business. And if your number's in my range, I'd love to, come out and visit you. Mm-hmm. And so the visit, I followed in most cases the same kind of roadmap where I would have dinner with them. And in most cases, it would be them and either their spouse or their number two. And then we would go tour the business after dinner when nobody was there. And so some of those tours would last, 5 or 6 hours. And I would always ask when we would be in their conference room at, 1 a.m, I would say, why me? Like, why did you, respond to my outreach? You must get, thousands of calls, every week, every month. And everybody except for one person said the same exact thing. They said, Shaun, I get 1,000 emails, but the fact that you called me piqued my interest enough to open the email that you sent me, read your materials, and the fact that you're going to come here and run the business and you're going to be an active part of the business and not an investor, that sparked my interest enough to reach back out to you and at least have a conversation with you. And again, everybody that I went to visit except for one person literally said the same thing verbatim, which was, I get a lot of emails. I don't get a lot of calls. Mm-hmm. And so, mm-hmm. So I think it is a way, to separate yourself. And especially in this business where, there are a lot of owners that are older and maybe what people might label as old school. And I definitely had success as far as responses.
Great. Well, that's a pretty good pitch for cold calling, Shaun. Thank you for that. Let's turn our attention now to Mitten, the business you found, your first acquisition. Spoiler, you've done 3, but Mitten was the first, and it's really kind of how you refer to the Holdco today, correct?
Yes.
Great. So tell us about Mitten Fluidpower. Yeah. If that isn't an industrial distribution sounding business, it's even got a kind of a Germany name to it.
Yep. So we bought the business from the Mitten family. Mm-hmm. They founded the business, I think it was 1971. Jack Mitten started the business in his garage, and grew it, from there. And the Mittens actually owned, when we bought the business, they owned 2 different companies. They owned the distribution business, or Mitten Fluidpower, which we bought, and then they owned a manufacturing business that we didn't buy. And so, it was, started by the dad, and John Mitten had been running it. And so, when we bought it, they were doing 14 million in sales. As of last month, we finished the month at, I think, 22 million, in sales. And so we've grown it over the last, 2.5 years. And, it wasn't rocket science as far as how we grew the business. We, added more salespeople. We opened up another location. We invested in our inventory. We invested in our marketing. And so we've seen a good return on investment, and actually saw a pretty quick return on some of those investments, especially with the sales team, as we've grown revenues over the last, 2.5 years.
Shaun, let me stop you there. There's some really good stuff in there. First of all, acquisition date was
December 14th, 2022.
December 22. So you're coming up on your 3-year anniversary of ownership, and you have grown revenue 50%, 50.
Yeah,
Great.
50 plus.
50 plus. Great. From 14 to 22. So one of the things that you'd said about the industrial distribution businesses is that they're low capex. And then we also just heard you say all the things that you've done, not rocket science, to grow this business over 50% in 3 years. More salespeople, more marketing, more inventory. So that means that more product is flowing through your distribution channel. That's what that means. So there are investments in all of that. But have you found, in fact, that even investing in the business for this growth, that the benefits of being in a business with low capex have really demonstrated themselves?
That's a good question. So from a capital expenditure perspective, I'm thinking of like machinery, heavy equipment. I'm not putting inventory and people in that CapEx category. Those are more reoccurring, expenses. And so, with Mitten, we spent about 1.2, 1.3 million in inventory, when we bought the business. And so, that was to get it back to a point that I felt was much more competitive in the marketplace, as far as having inventory in stock for, going back to what I talked about before, our typical customer or a typical customer is somebody walking in off the street, looking for a hose assembly. If we don't have the hose or we don't have the fittings, there's no sale. And so Mitten as an organization was very OEM focused, OEM, original equipment manufacturer. So they were getting their product spec'd in to mass production of, trains and braking systems and, power plants, turbines, things like that. But they were stepping over, the hose that exploded on the assembly line. And so I wanted to, sort of further diversify the business and not forget about the OEM business, but add in and balance out the MRO business, maintenance, repair, operation. So the only way to be a value-added resource on the MRO side is to have the inventory, because it's, the hoses are exploding or, a hydraulic pump is going down. And so we needed to make that investment. Whereas most owners, build up that inventory over a much longer period of time. And so I guess you could look at that as a CapEx investment, but it was more an investment in the business to get it to where we could be a value add resource to, to our customers in a better way than just working with them more on the OEM side of the house.
Great. And one thing that you'd said to me in our pre-call is that, how did you put it? Distribution businesses are sales engines. Does that sound familiar? And we also just heard you say, in fact, I think the very first thing that you said that you've done at Mitten, or you did at Mitten, was invest in more sales. So expand on that and that insight about distribution businesses being sales engines.
So one of the things that I looked for were companies that didn't have a sales strategy, and I always say a lot of business owners do a great job of working in their business, but they don't do that great of a job working on their business. And so that sales strategy was lacking, at Mitten and the other companies that we've looked at, and so. By coming in and having a much deeper focus on growth and on sales and on growing revenue, was a little bit different than what at least Mitten Fluidpower had been used to. And so a lot of owners are focused on other things other than sales, surprisingly, when it comes to these distribution businesses. And so we made that focus day one when we bought the company, and it's paid off. The other piece where I think a lot of the larger distribution firms, where they, at least in our space, where they forget that we're a local business. Localness is something that I always remember. And so, being where your customers are is vital in the world that we live in, because again, they're not going to drive 3 hours, for a busted hose. That, every minute that they're down, they're losing money. And so if we're not where our customers are, we're missing a huge opportunity. And so, as I mentioned, we opened up another location when we bought Mitten. We just opened a location on Friday right outside of Worcester, Mass, for the third company that we bought, FLN-MAR Rubber Plastics. Next month, we'll open up a second location for Frank Murken Products, which is the second business that we bought. And so it's all about that localness factor, but that sales focus and really making sure that our salespeople, not only do we have the right number of salespeople, but they're possessing the proper resources, to go out and win business. That's been our focus since day one. And, again, a lot of the companies that we looked at, didn't have that sales focus. In fact, one of the companies that we went fairly far down the road with, they didn't even have a sales team. I mean, I was blown away by when I asked them, how do you go out and acquire customers? They said, well, we really don't. The phone just rings. People just call us. And so in my head, I'm thinking, man, imagine, the growth that we could get if we had, a couple people out there shaking the trees. So, that's what I wanted. I wanted the business that hadn't focused on growth. And then my expertise, has always been in the sales leadership aspect of running a business. So that was kind of second nature to me to build that out and to have that focus.
Yeah. And so this would be another positive attribute of the entire category, you think, for the searchers listening. For industrial distributors in general, they're under sales staffed, and there's opportunity there.
Not every company, but I definitely think a lot of them, could use, more salespeople, could have a bigger focus on growth than they are. And especially with a lot of the older owners that, as I mentioned, are working in the business and not on the business. They also might not be investing, too heavily in the business, whether it's people or infrastructure. And so that's where I thought, these types of businesses, additional resources, additional people, and an additional focus could create a pretty winning combination, and it has so far for us.
Well, I think that's what's captured by the word sleepy. When you talk about a sleepy industry, there just isn't a lot of energy there. And if you are the one to bring new energy to an industry, there's presumably a lot of opportunity. So, Shaun, you've said it implicitly, but let's just hear you say that. So there's a retail component to this category also. Mm-hmm. Industrial distributors will have actual storefront. Mm-hmm. I can't say that I've ever been in an industrial distributor store. I assume they're not at the mall. What are they in, sort of industrial office park sort of things?
And you probably never will step foot in one for the rest of your life. So, so we, our stores are in industrial parks, office parks. The one we just opened is in I'll call it an industrial park. It's, next to a Ditch Witch dealer. And so, it's a small number when you look at the sales compared to the overall sales as far as the counter business. But it's a necessary piece of the ecosystem for us to service the local customer. And so back to that point of localness, we may be a supplier of hose kits, hose and fittings to a particular OEM, but when one of their machines goes down because a hose explodes, we need that counter resource where they can walk in and be out on their way in 15 minutes and get their equipment back up and running. And so that's a necessary part to the ecosystem to be a true value add distributor to your customers.
Yep. Great, Shaun. Well, we're getting toward the end here, and there's still a few segments I want to hit. I want to understand the how you bought Mitten, the structure and what you can share on acquisition price and so on, about your other two acquisitions, and then really just kind of big picture, what you've built, what you're building, what you're looking to do over the next 10 and 25 years.
So one thing we haven't talked about is I did not do what most people consider to be a traditional search. I had one investor through the search phase. It was someone that I met through someone that worked for me, and his name's Robert Wolf. And Robert Wolf is mainly known for being the longtime CEO of the Americas for UBS. Also, a lot of people know him for his political focus. He's the liberal guy on Fox News. So if you tune into Fox News, you'll see him a couple times a week. With
getting
all the
beat up on.
with all the conservatives. But he was a great partner. He covered all of the search expenses when I was searching, and really was an invaluable partner and part of the process. And then when we bought Mitten, we went out and raised equity, and so we raised about $6 million from outside investors, and Robert and I put in an equal amount. We each put in $250,000 to buy Mitten. So we used $6.5 million in equity, and then we put call it just over 3 times EBITDA in leverage on the business, split between mezzanine debt as well as a term debt and a line of credit. The second deal that we did, Frank Murken Products, we had grown the business so much in that first year, which we bought Frank Murken September 18th, 2023. So about call it 10 months after we bought Mitten. That was an all debt deal. Actually, the seller rolled some equity, and then the majority of that transaction was funded with additional debt that we took out on Mitten. And then fast forward to December 3rd, 2024. So about 10 months ago, we bought FLN-MAR Rubber and Plastics. And initially we set out to raise another $2 million. We had such, I don't want to say demand, but so much interest that we ended up raising about $4.5 million from the existing Mitten investors, and then put a little bit of debt, additional mezz and additional senior debt on the balance sheet to buy FLN-MAR. We haven't used SBA financing. It's been all through term debt through a senior lender, a cash flow loan, mezz, and then through our line of credit.
Sorry, but FLN-MAR, you did raise more equity.
We did, yeah. So
okay.
we raised another $4.5 million on top of the $6.5 for Mitten, the small amount of rollover equity with the second company that we had, and then FLN-MAR was another $4.5 million.
Right. Okay, great. And going back to the original structure of Mitten, the Mitten acquisition. So your investor, Wolf, paid for your search expenses. So he funded your search.
Mhm.
And then you guys went in 50-50 on additional skin in the game, additional equity into the project. And then raised, as you said, $6 million from other investors. What did your ownership stake end up being? Can you share that?
So we each of us own 25% of the business. And so we sold the rest to the investors, and together we own 25% of the company. And then together.
Okay.
And then we were diluted a little bit when we took the rollover equity, and then we took on a little bit of a different structure when we raised the equity for FLN-MAR, that brought us back, or has the potential to bring us back to 25% ownership of the overall company after the FLN-MAR deal.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything to say, given that we spent so much time hearing about your financial education, your later in life financial education, about how you thought about all this structuring? Because you obviously, on the other side of it, you're speaking very fluently about all of it. But I imagine as you were going through it, this was your first deal. And you were, despite the fact that you'd taken 2 great courses at Babson, you were still kind of learning as you went.
Yeah. So I originally set out to do, the structure that that most searchers take on. And, from the standpoint of, taking so much percentage ownership when you buy the company, then after 4 years, and then if you achieve a certain IRR. And, Wolf really talked me out of that and really talked me into, keeping it much simpler. Hey, we'll carve out this much and then sell, this much. And, back to something I said before, where PE is nothing more than a complex math problem, to get the IRR where we needed it to be, as far as investor equity, and then just to make the numbers work, that's how we landed on the 75-25 split. And then made it a little bit more complex with the FLN-MAR acquisition, with a unique a profits interest LLC, which I wish I knew about. I wish I knew about that when I was buying Mitten, because we would have probably taken on a little bit of a different structure in that case. But that's how we were able to bring us back to that 25% ownership, was through a profits interest LLC, where we were taking on, I think it's like 30%, and the investors got 70, but they get their money back plus a preferred rate of return before we see any money, in that structure.
Let's hear about the subsequent 2 acquisitions, just the numbers on them. Frank Murken, what was revenue there? And then FLN-MAR, what was revenue there?
FLN-MAR was just about $9 million in sales. And then Frank Murken was at just about $6 million in sales. So yeah, 14, 6, and 9, so $29 million. And I think the last financials we were at about $38 million in sales between the 3.
Fantastic. $38 million in sales, 3 acquisitions, started in your 40s. I say that because, many searchers are going to be in their 30s, some even in their late 20s if they're doing it coming right out of business school. But as I've said before, this path, you can move fast. 3 years. I mean, look what you've accomplished in 3 years. How do you reflect on how things have changed for your career?
The last 3 years have certainly gone by a lot faster than the first 20. I think that's probably because I'm having fun doing what I'm doing now. All 3 companies came with a lot of great people, and it wasn't me. It was a collective effort on growing the numbers and building something over time. But I'm happy. I mean, search was attractive to me because, I was making a lot of money, and it wasn't like I could step into something where, I was starting something from scratch. And so, buying an existing business, an existing successful business, made a lot of sense monetarily for me. And so, that piece was sort of, it was expected as far as how that was going to play out, but it's been a lot of fun, and I would definitely, 10 times out of 10, I would make this move again, because it's been fun. I've met great people. I've learned a new business, and it continues to be fun with acquisitions that we're looking at, the potential that we have with the existing businesses. And it's been a lot of fun growing.
Well, we're going to close out here with hearing about the future and what you have planned. But one question before that, you have found what happens so often with my guests, where it's so hard to get deal flow when you're an outsider looking in. But once you're in, i.e., after that first acquisition, deal flow becomes way easier. You're a perfect example. Expand on that, please.
Yeah, it's funny. I mentioned, during my time at Babson, the second time around, I met some other professors that were invaluable to me, during research. And, one of those guys, I never was a student in his class, but another one of those guys was someone that was kind of a searcher. He was an executive at a company, left, bought a business, and then went on to buy 4 more add-ons. And I'll never forget, he said to me, Shaun, the first one is the hardest. Mm-hmm. And your credibility skyrockets, once you own one business. And I would agree totally with that statement, in that, so many more people are willing to talk to me, or were willing to talk to me once we bought Mitten. But before that, the second company we bought was one of my targets. I had kind of a list of 100 businesses in that list of 29,000 that were kind of ideal targets for me. The second company we bought was on that list, and I had, called them a couple times. I'd even FedEx them, some material on me. And I didn't do that often. There were only 2 companies that, didn't really respond to my outreach. So I tried, reaching them in other ways. And I noticed the day I updated my LinkedIn after we bought Mitten, he was the owner of that business was looking at my LinkedIn, and I connected with him, sent him a note. Hey, I'd love to get together for lunch. And 8 days after we bought Mitten, I had lunch with the owner of Frank Murken Products. And that's when we started the negotiating process. And so I've seen firsthand where your credibility goes up, once you own a single business. And so, our pipeline continues to get bigger. I'm looking at deals that bankers bring me, which happens a lot more now that you own a business, the right types of deals. But I'm also, continuing to create my own deal flow and conversations that I'm having directly with sellers. Even a lot of the companies that I was talking to during my search phase, I continue to talk to those same folks, and hopefully a sale is something that will happen in the not so distant future. And the third business we bought, FLN-MAR, the seller of that business was somebody I was talking to, or I started talking to during my search. And so almost 3 years to the day of the first time I called that guy, we bought the company. And so the search has helped me, post acquisition as well.
Well, for the owners that didn't know you while you were searching, you've just got this credibility. You're in the industry. You're a counterpart to them. But for the owners that you contacted during your search, and then they can see this trajectory that not only did you get yourself into the business into the industry with an acquisition of a first business, but that you've acquired a second and a third. They must just think that you're the hottest thing. I mean, it's really quite for just some random guy out there trying to emailing me about buying my business to him actually having done it 3 times since I got that phone call and email from him. Pretty impressive. It's got to make quite an impression.
Thank you. I don't think I'm the hottest thing. I think I'm an anomaly. I certainly have a unique story, and I think a lot of owners look at me and they think I'm very different than a lot of the other buyers that are reaching out to them. And, I think our story and what we've done and how we've kept the branding in place and the employees, employed, and we've just kind of enhanced, what those previous owners did and what they built. And we invested in the business as opposed to trying to cut expenses. We've made investments, and it's, for us, it's paid off, obviously with the growth.
Well, close us out, Shaun, by your vision for the future. So, and maybe start with your time horizon here.
Sure.
So you mentioned not doing a traditional search. Traditional searches come with kind of a baked in expectation that there will be an exit. Does your model, your brand of search also diverge from that? Yeah.
So unlike a lot of searchers that are looking to exit in 7 to 10 years, I'm not looking to exit. And I hope to run this company for the next 20 to 25 years. Because I always think, well, if we sell, what am I going to do then? And so, I'm looking to grow and grow this thing through acquisition as well as organically, and grow it to as big as we can make it. And so, I think getting to $100 million in sales, in the next 5 years, both organically as well as through acquiring other businesses is very possible. And, at some point, maybe going public might be an avenue that we go down. An ESOP seems to be an attractive direction for us as well. But the idea is for now to continue to grow this thing and over time and not sell it, not grow it to sell it, but grow it to create a sustainable platform that, we can continue to grow up until, I'm no longer working, and maybe even beyond that.
What do you think differentiates your what you're attracted to in terms of doing a long-term build versus what other searchers are attracted to, which is that they'll be, looking at an exit after 5 or whatever years? Why do you think you like the long-term vision?
Kind of back to my point about, the first one is the hardest. I'd hate to walk away knowing that we've built, in my opinion, we already have the ideal platform business that we can add on to. And so I'm not saying that the infrastructure is exactly where I want it to be. We still have 3 companies that are on 3 different ERPs, and there's certainly a lot of synergies that we can create within the business. But it's going to be really hard for me to give up what I feel is a great platform that we can continue to add on to, to walk away from that and either try to do it again or do something else. Just at this point is not attractive to me. And I think we have an opportunity to make something huge, and we're certainly well on our way of doing that. And I just don't want to walk away from that in 7 to 10 years.
Well, and building something huge just takes time also. Mm-hmm. So if you start with that goal of wanting to build something huge, implied in that is a lot of years.
Absolutely.
the other thing that you just said about, you've built this platform now. Why would you want to go do another one? Is sort of the compounding argument. That word gets, I think, thrown around a lot. But now, is when things should start to accelerate. I mean, you're building momentum, more capital to work with, more network, more of a broader network in the industry, more well-known in the industry, more, deeper understanding of what good and bad looks, et cetera. I mean, it's all just getting higher quality and getting, dare I say, easier in some sense.
I wouldn't say easier, but I would say getting more experience from the acquisition perspective, but also, the hard part is the integration, understanding what works, what doesn't work. I was fortunate enough at my time at Morgan Stanley to live through an integration when Morgan Stanley bought, Smith Barney. And so I'm always calling on that experience when it comes to integration, and always remembering that people implicitly hate change. And so that's always in the back of my head. But, over time, we're getting better at it and making it easier, and, sort of creating our own internal playbook as far as how we go about doing that. And, if it's, I wouldn't say getting easier, but it's, we're learning, learning a thing or two, and applying that, to future integrations certainly is a positive.
Getting better, maybe.
Getting better. Yeah.
But it is just this interesting point that so often in kind of private equity, to the extent that search is private equity, you right when things are starting to really blossom is when the exit happens. And so all of that great blossoming, the almost the harvesting, right? The next guy, your buyer, gets to enjoy, not you. So why give it up right at that moment, right when the really getting the foundation, the J curve, all of that, right as it's behind you, then sell? No, that's when you really want to double down and start enjoying the momentum. I'm oversimplifying, but there's definitely something to this.
Sure.
And just how do your investors feel about this? Of course, part of the reason that people sell is not just because they feel like it, but because their investors want their capital back. So we're often beholden to their time constraints, the investors, LPs' time constraints. What is your relationship to them?
Yeah, so all the investors know about what my long-term vision is for the business, and all are long-term investors. The general response that I got was, as long as you're involved, we'll still be involved. The minute you step away is when we're going to want our capital back. And so I think most, not all, but most of the investors are in it, for the next, 20 to 25 years. And that was something that I was, very, very upfront about. One thing I didn't mention before, searchers are always intimidated by or at least I find that they're intimidated by raising capital. That piece was, I'm not going to say it was easy, but that was not as difficult as I thought it was going to be. When I launched my search, I updated my LinkedIn, and I literally got, 50 people reaching out to me, had 50 people reaching out to me saying, hey, if you buy a company and you raise money, I'd love to invest.
You changed your LinkedIn and got all of this inbound from investors?
Yeah. Yeah.
What, how? I have not heard that experience from other searchers.
So I'm older, so my network is bigger than a typical searcher. I don't have an investment dollar from a typical search investor. Yeah. And so it's all people from my network that I've either worked with or, people I've met along the way. And so yeah, when I updated my LinkedIn launching North Iron Holdings, I literally had like 50 people message me, call me, text me, and say, if you raise money, I'll invest with you. Now
Wow.
we didn't take money from all 50 of those people. We only took money from about 12 people. Probably the best piece of advice that Robert Wolf gave me was, remember that these people are going to be your partner long term. And so when you take their money, you don't want the guy that's calling you every single day saying, how's the company doing? And so, you want the person that you talk to a few times a year and give them updates, and but that aren't a gnat flying around your head. And so, we were very
Selective.
specific or selective or deliberate in how we're approaching the capital raise, and so we only reached out to a subset of those 50, and then a few more people. But yeah, that was, again, I'm not going to say it was easy, but it wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be, from a capital raise perspective.
Well, Shaun, I think this advantage comes not just from having been an older searcher, but having spent your entire industry around high net worth individuals. I mean, that's who you were serving, right?
Yeah,
So it's people with capital to deploy. So great. Anything we didn't hit that you wanted to, Shaun?
I thought, staying in corporate America, I thought that was a riskier decision than launching a search. I was overly prepared, when I left the bank and launched my search. I had spent 5 years sort of doing diligence around, how I would do it, et cetera. And so there were certainly unknowns, but I thought this was not a riskless decision, but a less risky decision than staying in corporate America. And maybe that's part of the reason why I don't really want to sell. I mean, I'm the owner, I'm running the business, I'm getting a paycheck, I'm the one making the decisions. Obviously, I have to answer to investors. But, unless I run the business into the ground, which hopefully doesn't happen, knock on wood, I have a job for life. Versus being in corporate America, I felt there was risk to that.
Because one person's decision above you on the hierarchy could mean the end of that job, all your revenue, the kind of the joke or the expression that having a W-2 is 100% customer concentration. All your revenue is coming from one customer, your employer. But also, I guess the further you go in your career, the harder it is to get jobs if you were to happen to lose the one you got.
Yeah,
why is being mid-40s successful in your corporate career? Why did that feel riskier than buying a business?
The employment decision, granted it was a fruit of my labor, but to your point, a new regime could come in and, I could be, out on the street, like that. And so there was risk, to being in corporate America. And, I felt like leaving and searching and buying a company was less risky. And I know there's a lot of, people in their 40s that kind of feel like they're stuck, because they have a big W-2 and, like me, they have a mortgage, a spouse and children and bills and et cetera. But I think search, if done correctly, can be a great segue into, a new career, and what I feel like is a less risky career than, to your point, having that customer concentration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent point. I thank you for coming on and sharing your story of acquiring Mitten and then Frank Murken and FLN-MAR and teaching us about industrial distribution. It sounds like the industry is big enough that you're not bothered or threatened by other searchers getting in. Come on in, the water's warm, and there's 28,997 other companies that searchers can go by. So pretty interesting to hear about an industry that we haven't before. And congratulations on how far you've come in just 3 years and on doing it mid-career. Part of the reason probably that we don't have more mid-career searchers is because there's more risk involved when you, as you said, have a family, have a mortgage, et cetera. So it takes that much more kind of chutzpah to go out and do it. And doing it, you are. So thank you very much, Shaun Stimpson.
Thanks for having me, Will.
Hope you enjoyed that interview. Don't forget to subscribe to the Acquiring Minds newsletter. We send an email for every episode with an introduction to the interview, a link to the video version on YouTube, and soon, key takeaways, numbers, and more essentials from the interview for those of you who don't have time to listen or watch it. Subscribe at acquiringminds.co. You'll also find all our webinars there on the website, both those we have coming up and recordings of past webinars. At this point, there are over 30 webinar recordings, a wealth of information on all the technical nitty-gritty of buying a business. acquiringminds.co.